Your power is a fusion between the chair in which you sit and yourself. The chair has most of that power. Were you to leave that chair, would anyone even be listening to you? Or how small would your audience be?
You talked about that a lot of the criticisms of the members of the intellectual dark web were made by people in the legacy media who had kind of inherited their seats.
What are my responsibilities? We've never worked this out. We've never had a really good conversation about the fact that the Sam Harris platform and the Sam Harris human are very different than let's say, the Michelle Goldberg human on the New York Times platform. And a lot of these traditional commentators have lower engagement as individuals. And if you think about the fusion between the chair and the human, the chair has a lot of the power. Like anytime the New York Times says that person there is worth listening to, that person, whether they have interesting ideas or not, or good or bad ideas, becomes super important because they inherit power from the chair. So now when that sort of set of responsibilities comes through to me, like I don't have a book, I don't have a show, I got nothing. My wife tells me, I'm tired of your theories. Go to Twitter and try it out with your audience. Like that's my platform. And then I hear things like, Eric, you have a platform. You have a tremendous responsibility. It's like, what platform? I signed up for Twitter. And that kind of weird new problem is super interesting because I've never really had to think about this. I built the entire thing completely 100% by myself, while I'm like doing the dishes, and I'll type something and then suddenly, I've got 1,000 people who are angry at me or really interested in something I have to say. We haven't had the discussion about the ethics of what if you succeed at what it is that you're doing on social media. We're inheriting these questions from people who inherited their platforms. And we didn't inherit our platforms. We built our platforms. So we've never actually had a really good ethics discussion also about dining a la carte. There are very few people who are so horrible that they've never said anything remotely interesting or reasonable. I mean, I challenge you, Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy probably said reasonable things. Pass the sugar, please. Not every instance of an utterance from a bad person, a horrible person, is horrible or without content.
And so a lot of the criticisms were a sort of set of journalistic ethics that you thought were not appropriate for someone who built their platforms by hand.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you talk more about that?
Well, the idea is if you've been given a position at, let's say, The Atlantic or the New York Times, your power is a fusion between the chair in which you sit and yourself. The chair has most of that power. Were you to leave that chair, would anyone even be listening to you? Or how small would your audience be? So when you have that sort of a situation, you can talk about whether or not somebody is abusing the power of the chair that they have inherited. Even the concept of platforming somebody. I mean, this was not a verb that I was aware of until very recently. I'm sure we could do a Google Ngram search and find out that it's relatively recent in origin. Now, when somebody says, well, you have a platform, you have a responsibility, I think, wait, what? I have a YouTube channel. Like, you have a YouTube account, I have a YouTube account. Like, well, your YouTube account is over 100,000 subscribers. Yes, but that's because people started subscribing to my channel. It's not that, I got a job at Eric Weinstein YouTube channel, and then I had the responsibility of being the custodian of this channel. It's like, screw off. What the hell are you talking about? You're revealing, in essence, that you and I are in different circumstances. Now, it's not to say I don't have any responsibilities. Far from it. But to talk about, well, you have such a large platform, what are you going to do with, like, PewDiePie? Well, who the hell is PewDiePie? I mean, PewDiePie is a guy with a channel, and whatever he did, it built an incredible followership. Now, does he have responsibilities? Yes, but really as an individual, he has responsibilities. And I do agree that, it's a little bit daunting that he's got this many people listening to him. But on the other hand, it's very, very different than the idea of this has been passed to you and you must pass it to the next person, and that this vehicle effectively came with most of the interest. We chose you, and we gifted you this power. So now, with great power comes great responsibility. That's very different than somebody who built something with their own sweat and people flock to it. That's the market saying, okay, well, I'm going to forego all the pleasures of listening to the synchronized legacy stuff, and I'm going to actually dine a la carte off the menu.
Because this is really interesting to me, because I worked in the newsroom at Channel 4 News for 10 years. I've worked at the BBC. I've internalized a lot of those kind of mainstream media values, and I'm sort of seeing how they apply to Rebel Wisdom, which has been going for about 2 years. And at their best, I would say that some of the values are good faith engagement. It's that you should always, if you have any allegations or any kind of claims to put about someone, you should put them to the person first and get a response, which seems like a good rule of thumb. That you would give space for people to respond. Fact checking should be integral to journalism. We can kind of talk about that the mainstream media is not actually doing a lot of the things that it should have been
doing. Or doing them very selectively and saying, we're going to fact check the hell out of this, and we're going to give this other thing a free pass. I think this is where the gonzo critique of journalism comes in. It's like, would you stop pretending to be God with a God's eye view of the universe, and don't talk about yourself as the queen in the first person plural, for God's sakes. You have a perspective, you have biases, you have friendships. I'd rather that you sort of tell me, well, I happen to be friends with the subject, so I'm not going to necessarily throw that person under the bus. And it's very funny when you see some of these people say, well, you gave so-and-so a free pass. You're like, you mean my friend? I gave a free pass? The person who comes over to dinner, you expect me to somehow have an obligation to you to air all of my misgivings about that person for your viewing pleasure because of my responsibility to the public? Where did you come up with this, you dear sweet child? I expect to be able to tell people so-and-so is a friend of mine, or for example, my relationship with Nassim Taleb. I love Nassim. Now, does Nassim piss me off? Does he frighten me? Do I think he's out of control when he beats up on other people that I know and like? I have real trouble with what he's doing. But do you expect me to stab him in the back for your pleasure because of my commitment to some journalistic code of ethics that no journalist is following when I'm not a journalist? I mean, very funny that you've developed all of these strong feelings and beliefs and entitlements.
But it is very interesting. I think I completely agree with the rise of the alternative media has shown up that the mainstream media has a perspective, like this kind of God's eye view affectation is shown more and more as an affectation, like it's very obvious.
Well, look at them on Twitter. They're the most biased, completely activist people you could imagine, pretending that, whenever I get one of these people, I always say, can we go over to the journalistic code of ethics and see which points, because you're violating 3A paragraph 2.
But I would say that you've also hinted at what some of the other failure conditions of the new sense-making platforms are, and they're very human failings. They're kind of potentially audience capture, they are friendships and human contact or human relationships between some of the people involved can also start to become warping of truth.
It could be, but one of the things that we like to do, I think, is to say, well, so-and-so is my friend. I have a great deal of private information. Like, I don't think it's a secret that I don't like Ben Shapiro's Red Meat Act. And I call it the Red Meat Act. That's about as far as I want to go. I don't want to undermine Ben's ability to earn a living or produce an entertaining news analysis product. And I've taken him to task in public. But in private, when I call him up, he's about the most responsive, reasonable, tolerant, kind person in my one-on-one. Now, that is a little uncomfortable because I don't see the same person on the phone as the sort of firebrand who sits behind the desk. Are those two people connected? They're absolutely connected. Ben and I don't share the same perspectives on the phone, but we probably share 95% of the analysis. And then there's like a very extreme turn at the end. But I think that my people are much more, anybody listening to me is much better informed about the fact that this dichotomy between public Ben and private Ben even exists. So I would claim that you're actually getting better information from me than you are somebody saying, I would never talk to a person like Ben Shapiro because once in 2009 he said the following thing.
Yeah, and just talking about kind of the evolution of journalistic ethics within the alternative media, one of the things that I was looking at and was really interested by was Joe Rogan's interview with Jack Dorsey, where he got this huge pushback from his audience. And then in I think the podcast afterwards, so just to recap for people, so Jack kind of basically stonewalled, didn't give particularly kind of complete answers, and Joe maybe didn't know enough to kind of push back, and kind of it was as Joe said, it was a kind of crappy interview. But in the next interview, I think with Sam Harris, he went through that interview and was kind of like, I've got this responsibility that I never asked for, I never knew that I had, I just like talking to people, and suddenly my audience has given me all of this crap for not asking Jack Dorsey to defend sort of Twitter's banning and the way that Twitter censors people on their platform, and kind of his audience really felt like he'd let them down. And what I really respected about Joe was that you saw him go through this process of, I never asked for this responsibility, but now I realise that I have it, and I'm gonna do better. He got Tim Pool on for one of the future shows to have Jack Dorsey on again.
But then Jack Dorsey came on with a
lawyer.
With a lawyer.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that what I feel that I'm seeing with Joe Rogan is this evolution in real time of this is actually and actually taking on some of the responsibilities that he never really asked for. Do you see it the same way?
Not exactly. I mean, I think, at some point, I think I got a call from Joe or a text message, I couldn't remember. And I don't want to reveal the private contents, but more or less he's kind of like, what did I just do? I just said something about Bernie, and suddenly the Bernie Sanders campaign is running some sort of ad that says I've endorsed him. I was like, well, sort of you did in accordance with the new rules of the world. I think one of the things that a lot of us are doing is trying to break these expectations about, do you endorse? Do you condemn? Do you condone? Just like, would you shut up? I'm a human being. I talk to people. I don't check all of their backgrounds all the time. I don't know if they've had a tweet, in 2011 that, looks terrible. And then I start to learn the context, and now I find the whole history. It's like, you can't move through the world if you're saddled with all this. So is it great that Joe is thinking a little bit more about the responsibilities of being effectively the largest show out there? Yeah, I think to an extent. And if he overthinks it, it's going to be terrible, because then you're not going to have an authentic person. You're going to have the same thing creeping in to Joe's thought process, and it'll be self-censorious. So I think we should take on some amount of ethics, and we should also give ourselves a budget for ethical failings, for failures of reason, for failures of fairness. And do I think the institutions should have much lower budgets? Yeah, they're institutions. They're funded. They're long-term things that were not usually built by any of the people who are in them. So I believe that the institutional responsibilities are far too low, and the game is to foist personal responsibility onto the individuals who are outside of the Citadel. So I'm excited about the fact that Joe wants to take on a responsibility, because I think he's a good guy who wants to do well by the world. Do I believe that he has the same responsibilities as the New York Times for fact checking, for, he says things like, I voted for Gary Johnson because he came on my show, or I've met with people and I really like Tulsi, Yang, and Sanders because they're not corporate people, and I'm not a corporate guy, I'm a comedian. But that is the level at which you're getting the analysis. He's speaking as a human being, as human beings speak. He's not speaking the way somebody from a management consulting firm or a PR agency would coach you to speak. And I think that's very important.